Evan's sermon today. Please let the rest of the week go well for everyone, Lord. In Jesus' name, we all said.
Awesome. Yes, be seated. How's it going, guys? Everybody doing all right? Did y'all know we have coffee in our lobby? If you're interested in that, okay. Joke isn't going to land this morning. That's all right. All right. Thanks, man. I appreciate the cursory laugh there. Bail me out of trouble. That was really good because it was fun. That was a rough start to things. If that's how we were gonna do things this morning. Can everybody see that? Okay, everybody pretty good with that? Very cool. Nobody said anything, so that's a yes. Good morning. Good morning. All right, so. We are probably, let me start this way this morning. Maybe you noticed there's a few people without masks on, all that stuff, and maybe you've been tracking things, and maybe you were sort of eagerly anticipating what is our response going to be to all that. And I'll just say it's going to be the same that, I guess, the same that the CDC has come out with. So masks are optional, especially for those that are vaccinated, that you can wear that or not. And if you feel that you've been vaccinated and you would still want to wear a mask, then that's totally up to you as well. And I think that's the last thing I'm probably ever going to say about masks from this stage. All right, so that's, finally glad to sort of put that thing to rest. But so that's where we're at with that, and I think that was it. And I think Veronica did a phenomenal job hitting all of our announcements and stuff this morning. So I think that just leaves us to get started. So I have been outside enjoying the very nice weather, and every time I do that, there is this big mountain. Have you guys noticed this big mountain out there? Yeah, I notice it every time it's out, and it like beckons me to come and climb it. Anybody else that's like, it just stands there as this testimony to your failure that you haven't climbed it? Yes. Noel, yes, we're going, right? A few people, a few like type A'ers that are like, we're going to the top of that thing, right? And Danielle is like so responsible and tells me, no, you're not. Actually, every time that I tell her that I want to do that, and I like really do. I want to go climb the mountain. And here's the deal: it's like, do I have rock climbing abilities? No, I don't. I am in no physical condition. I have not exercised like at all since I got out of the military, and so I would die halfway up that mountain. I have no like business climbing that mountain, but I like want to climb, and I want to be able to summit the peak, right? It just sort of stands there as this testimony of like, you haven't conquered me yet. Anybody like resonate with that feeling, right? Yeah, okay. A few of you that can sort of get, the rest of you are going to be lost for about the next 5 minutes as I give this illustration, right? But I was watching a documentary about K2. You guys know what K2 is? So Everest is the tallest. K2 is like the hardest mountain to summit. It's one of those, I think it's over 30,000 foot peaks maybe. One of like 5 of those in the world maybe. And unlike Everest, it is like one of the hardest mountains to climb. Most dangerous. It requires the most technical ability to be able to climb K2. And as you're going to see here in a minute, very few people actually make it to the summit of K2. But I was watching this documentary, and this guy who actually has been one of the very few people that have made it to the summit of K2 says this. He says that, man, if you only go to K2, right, if it's only about reaching the summit, you are doing it for the wrong reasons, and you will likely end up a frozen body on the side of the mountain. I didn't get the guy's name, but direct quote. There you go. If that's the only reason you go to K2, which sort of to me, right, as the type A personality driven, I just want to get to the top of Rainier, right? Like, dude, if I go all the way to Nepal or wherever K2 is at, right? Iran maybe? Anyways, if I go all the way to there to like summit this thing, bro, I'm going to the top, right? Like I'm making it to the summit. And yet, this experienced mountaineer says that if you go there with that attitude, if it's only about the summit and you making it to the top, then you're going to die along the journey. And here's the deal. Instead, you have to see it, and this is his quote, instead, you have to see it as an experience and enjoy the entire journey. And I want to talk about that sort of concept this morning because for some of us, maybe very few of us, like we're sort of summit driven. Like we just want to make it to the top of that thing. And yet we can get lost in the journey and lose out on what's actually a really beautiful, incredible journey experience along the way. Dude, they are wound up back there, man. Because here's the deal. If you want to take getting to the top of K2 seriously, right, man, it is practice. It is years of rock climbing experience that you just can't, you can't go take an online master's class and be ready to do the stuff you need to do. I took this Boy Scouts, knot tying class one time, and we're good to make it up to the top of K2. It's like, no, man, you will slide down that rope and you will be a greasy spot on the bottom of the rocks, right? Not just that, it's ice climbing experience, rock climbing, ice climbing experience. And where the heck do you even do ice climbing at? Is there Alaska? Is that pretty much the only place that we do that? Is there somewhere around here? Maybe Rainier, right? It's physical training. It is financial. The people who make it to the top of K2 rearrange their entire finances around this, man. They're not the type of people that you see vacationing at Disney World, all right? They're when it's their time, they're going to, Summit, or they're going to Yosemite and they're climbing the nose or they're climbing the Matterhorn or something, right? That's the stuff that those type of people that actually make it to the top of K2 do on their free time. And they've rearranged every aspect of their finances to be able to do this. It's over $100,000 worth of food, equipment, and travel, not to mention the $32,000 in guide services that you're going to pay to do this, right? So you're talking upwards of $150,000 to go climb K2. I don't know about you guys, but I don't have that sort of disposable income sitting around, right? And yet, man, they've structured every aspect of their life to do this. 52 days, that's the average time to climb K2. Man, they are really having a good time back there. 52 days, that's the average time to climb K2. So again, that doesn't include the 2 weeks of travel time to and from. That doesn't include any extra time that you need to spend there. And on average, people end up spending an extra 3 weeks there, just give or take because of the weather, right? And so, man, I don't know about you guys, but I also don't have 3 months worth of vacation that I can just sort of blow to go do this either, right? And so as you can see, right, you really have to structure every aspect of your life around this. And here's the deal. Of last report, there have only been 377 people reach the summit of K2. 377 people. And of that, 87 people have died along the way, right? Dude, that's a lot of people for very little return on that, right? Compare those numbers to over 9,000 people who have made it to the top of Everest with only 300 deaths, right? Not commensurate there. K2 is incredibly, incredibly dangerous. And here's the deal. I say all of that to say this. You don't just go climb K2, right? You don't just go and do that. In fact, if the summit is all that it's about for you, then that whole process sounds miserable. Can anybody agree? I do not like rock climbing. I'm kind of afraid of heights, and so the thought of going out and climbing the Matterhorn or something, climbing the nose on, down at Yosemite on my time off does not sound like a fun vacation to me. And yet the people who summit K2, they enjoy the entire experience. They enjoy the vacations going down to Yosemite, man. They enjoy structuring their life and their exercise and their diet and every part. They enjoy taking naps in hyperbaric chambers and doing crazy things that regular people just don't do so that they can do this thing. But even when they're there on site at K2, it still isn't just about the summit because they have to keep perspective even in that moment. And here's the deal, man. It's maybe you're one of the few people that are just kind of giving me the blank stares right now, and this entire illustration is lost on you because you don't even want to touch Rainier, right? And I get that. And so let me give us maybe an example that I think almost everyone can relate to. How about kids? Right? If you've had kids or have ever been a kid, I think that hits almost all of us, right? If I were to ask you on any given day, why do you have kids? And we just zoomed in on any particular day. Could that maybe be a difficult question to answer on that day? Let's just be honest. Yeah. There are days that could be a really, man, I don't actually know. This is, I love my kids to death, but I don't really know why we had 4 of them, or whatever the case. But and so if I zoom in too close on any particular moment, and it's the hours and hours and hours banging your head against the wall, doing mountains of homework, right? Dude, what are we doing? What are we doing here with this? But then all of a sudden, there is that mountaintop experience when the grades come in, and you see the confidence boost in this little boy, man, that's been struggling and striving for this thing for a long time. And all of a sudden, it puts in perspective this thing that, man, you've worked for forever on. What about the hundreds of missed pitches, right? And dude, that's frustrating, and I'm super competitive, and so I oftentimes get way more frustrated than I should about that. And then, but then what happens when you see the smile on the face of that little girl who knocks in the winning run for a team? And all of a sudden, man, it isn't just the mountaintops that even in that moment, the journey to get to that place is beautiful. And it takes on a perspective that maybe we miss if we're not careful, right? And it isn't just climbing mountains, and it isn't just raising kids, that this is actually every aspect of our life. And that it isn't just about those mountaintop experiences. Actually, man, to live life to its fullest, to live life in a way that I think we were designed to live it in, you have to appreciate the entire journey. And because we're in church, I want to talk about faith in this regard this morning. You guys good with that? If you're not, I don't have anything else. So, I think that's going to be where we're heading, right? Our faith is no different, right? Our faith is this thing, and it is this journey that we are on. And you guys have heard me make these statements about your next step of faith. Everybody tracking? Everybody, if you've been here, you should have heard me say that at least at some point, right? That what is your next step of faithfulness along this journey? So this morning, I want to sort of sync our language up and give us this sort of unified language and terminology around this idea that faith is a journey. And every one of us are on it. Even if you would claim that you're not, to some degree, you're on this spectrum, you're on this journey of faith, man. And seeing it as a journey changes the way we relate to it. And it's a really, really big deal. Are you guys good? Everybody good? Okay, here's the deal. We're going to do this as we talk through Jacob's story. Now, I want to just briefly go back because I think there may be a few people that don't know who Jacob is, and if that's you, that is completely fine because we're going to tell you the story of Jacob this morning, right? Jacob was this character in the Old Testament. He was actually a twin of another brother named Esau, and Esau was born first, and Jacob came out holding on to Esau's heel. And so thereby Jacob gets the name of Jacob, which means heel grabber, supplanter, or deceiver. That is to say that you would grab someone's heel to trip them up and to get ahead of them in line, right? Namely, the birth order. And actually, Jacob really lives into this namesake over the course of his life, right? A couple of different times, Jacob steals what is rightfully Esau's because Esau was the older brother. And so you had the birthright. And that was whenever dad passed away, you got the double blessing of everything. So everything was split up, and you got 50% more than all of the younger siblings combined got. And so Jacob steals this from his older brother at one point, Esau. And so he really lives into this namesake that he grabs his heel, man, and he trips him up. He uses his weakness. He is a deceiver. And then the next thing that he does is he steals his blessing. That is this continuation of this blessing that God had given to Abraham and had passed on to Isaac and now to him as Jacob, right? It was going to be passed on to Esau, that he was going to make him this great father of nations. His descendants were going to outnumber the stars, right? Everything that you put your hand to was going to succeed. This blessing, everybody kind of tracking along with that, right? And he comes in this weird sort of sitcom style move, steals the blessing from his older brother. And you think it went over good or bad? Good or bad? Yeah, not so good, right? And so his brother's name Esau means big red, literally. That's what it means, right? Just big, hairy, red dude. And Esau was sort of the softer, like to hang out in the tent and eat grapes sort of guy, you know. And so you can imagine how that fight would have went if it would have went down. And not so great. And so Jacob has to get out of Dodge, and Jacob is on the run at this point in the story, right? And this is where we're going to pick up with Jacob. And what we're going to see is these mountaintops and these valleys in his journey of faith. Are you guys tracking? You guys good with this? All right, here we go. Genesis chapter 28, if you have your Bible. If not, we've got it here on the screen. Genesis chapter 28, verses 10 through 22. I want to say this too. I operate out of the New American Standard Bible, so if you're the type that you really like to know what version I'm in so you can track, or maybe you're using a different version and you don't like the mismatch and you want to change if you're on your phone or something. That's what I use, right? In NASB, New American Standard Bible. So here it is. Genesis 28, verse 10 through 22. Then Jacob departed from Beersheba and went towards Haran, right? So Beersheba, that's where the deception took place. He's heading towards Haran. He's got some family there in Haran. He might be able to find like some safety or something like that, right? And he came to a certain place, and he spent the night there because the sun had set. And he took one of the stones of the place, put it under his head, and laid it down in that place, the original My Pillow. He had a dream, and behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching to the heavens. So in this dream, this like sort of trance-like state, he begins to have this vision of like this ultimate reality of the kingdom of God in heaven, and it's just sort of like the I don't know, the reality of this world is sort of peeled back, and he gets to see kind of behind the curtain, right? And he has this dream. Behold, a ladder was set on the earth with its top reaching into heaven, and behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord. Underline this if you do that sort of thing in your Bible, right? I'm the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give it to you and to your descendants. Your descendants, this is that blessing, right? This is passing on to Jacob. Your descendants will also be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south. And in you and in your descendants shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Behold, and underline this, right? Highlight this if you're on your phone. Behold, I am with you. I will keep you wherever you go and will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So Jacob rose early in the morning and took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up as a pillar, poured oil on its top. Not sure what that's about. He called the name of that place Beth-El. So Beth in Hebrew is house. El is short for God, right? It's the house of God. And however, previously the name of the city had been Luz. Then Jacob made a vow saying, check this out, if God will be with me on this journey that I take and will give me food to eat and garments to wear, and I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. This stone which I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and all that you give me I will surely give a tenth back to you. Everybody good with that? Everybody tracking along the story? So Jacob on the run from his brother, he lays down, he has this dream. God comes to extend this blessing to Jacob. And so this is the whole descendants. This is about the fifth time in the story in the book of Genesis that we've seen this blessing come about. And this time it's passing on to Jacob, right? But Jacob isn't so sure about this. Did you notice this, right? Just with a cursory reading of Jacob's story, did Jacob have faith in a relationship with God, do you think? Yeah, I'm going to say no, right? I see some heads shaking no. I'm going to say no. I actually don't think that he did. And here's why. Let me just point these things. This is why I had you underline this, right? Look at how God introduces himself. This matters big time in the story. This matters. Behold, the Lord stood above it, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of who? Of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. He didn't say anything about being his God. And yet later on in the story, whenever, like, just spoiler alert, he does become Jacob's God, right? Later on in the story, when God introduces himself, what does he say? He says, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, right? He really, he includes himself in this, and yet not yet in this part of the story. That's Genesis 28:13. And then look at Jacob's response to God blessing him. And by the way, who in the world would talk to God this way? It's kind of funny to me, right? Here's what he does. It sets up this if-then sort of paradigm. If God will be with me, and he will keep me on this journey that I take, and if he will give me food to eat, and if he will give me garments to wear, and if I return to my father's house in safety, then the Lord will be my God. Is it safe to say that perhaps Jacob had a little bit of skepticism when it came to this God? Maybe, and this God's claims to be able to do what he says he was going to do, right? And maybe this God's claim to the power that he supposedly has. So I'm going to draw something here, and I'm not going to say much about it yet, but we'll say this is Jacob's skepticism, and I'm just going to put that there for right now. Jacob had seen the reality that there was a God, right? Like, obviously, he had this dream, and God's real, and it was terrifying, and it prompted a response from him, and yet he had questions about God's motives, God's ability to actually do this, God's ability to follow through with what he had claimed. Is God really good, maybe? Have you heard any of these questions, maybe? And especially maybe if you come to faith later in life, this is undoubtedly a hurdle that you had to sort of come across at some point, right? Maybe it started with like God isn't real or whatever, and then maybe over time you saw this thing like, okay, well, what if he is? Or maybe he actually is, but like, can he actually affect my circumstances? Can he do anything about where I'm at? Does he listen to prayer? All those things. Those pretty familiar, like, sort of skepticisms. And here's what I want to share with you this morning is like those are absolutely normal, natural questions and skepticisms to have. And we see this in Jacob's story, right? So here's the deal. We have Jacob's life, and I'm going to put it up here on our board. And we have his early years up to his first Bethel experience. And Jacob actually has 3 Bethel experiences over the course of his life. And we're going to look at 2 of those. The third one I'm going to sort of mention in passing. But I've picked Jacob's story, and I'll show you really why here in a little bit. But I've picked Jacob's story because we see something in Jacob's story that we actually don't get a glimpse of really in many of the other like Old Testament characters' stories. Most of the other Old Testament characters are really focused around these sort of mountaintop like experiences. And yet, we just went through about 9-10 verses here of Jacob's mountaintop experience. And the rest of Jacob's experience is definitely a valley, right? And we get those aspects of Jacob's story. And so I want to kind of explain what the next few years look like for Jacob. So whether you know the story or this is a refresher, I want to just go back into what Jacob's story looks like. And this is super, super important, right? So Jacob makes it to Haran, and he immediately finds this distant relative of his that was pretty cool for them to marry back in the day, I guess. And she's like the most beautiful woman that he has ever seen in his life. But don't forget, Jacob is completely poor. He just ran from his family. He has nothing but the clothes on his back to offer the dad of this girl. So he can't pay the dowry to like take this girl as his bride. And so the father says, that's cool, man. You can work for me for 7 years. And so, man, the Bible says that he worked for 7 years, and it's like it was nothing, man. Like he blinked and it was over with. But it was hard, strenuous, terrible, terrible labor. And we're going to find out later that his father-in-law actually wasn't above like sabotaging him in his pursuits, right? And so he works for 7 years. Wedding night comes around. She wears the thick veil, right, over her face. That was traditional. They go into the tent. I'll leave the rest of that up to your imagination. But the next morning, there's light coming through the tent. Veil is off at this point. And holy smokes, plot twist, it's not his lovely bride that he expected. And actually, it's the older sister that the Bible tells us was like ugly as homemade soap. And he was like not too favorite. It actually says that she had like cow eyes or whatever. And it just really translates out to like she was not very attractive, right? And so you have on one hand the really attractive sister, and then you have the unattractive. And he's been duped, right? And they're like, what the heck, man? And so he goes to the dad, and the dad says, sorry, man, it's just not our custom. We can't give away the younger daughter. But I tell you what, you work for 7 more years, and I'll give you the younger daughter too. And he's like, all right, man, 7 more years of strenuous, terrible labor, and goes by like it's nothing. And this time it works, right? But then like the real pain begins. Like you think that's bad. The real pain begins next because there's like a war of the womb that goes on. And these women start like having kids. And it's like who can outdo the other one to have more kids? And then they give him like their like attendants and their slave girls to like have kids with. Man, I don't know, but it gets weird and it gets like really dramatic over the next few years. And then like family drama that you and I just can't even imagine. And then he has his father-in-law that's actively trying to sabotage everything that he does. Well, he has enough of it one day, and he leaves. And he leaves in a way that nearly gets him killed. Again, Jacob lives into his namesake of being a supplanter and a deceiver, walks out the door, and it nearly gets him and some of his family killed, but it sort of works out. God intervenes for him. He runs back into God at Bethel again on his way out, and literally wrestles with God in a move that leaves him wounded for life. To this day, you ever wonder why Jews eat kosher? They don't eat from the waist down on an animal. It's because Jacob wrestled with God and God touched his hip. A lot of other stuff going on in that, but all of a sudden now this is unclean, and because of this, Jews don't eat anything from hip down on an animal, right? So that's what it means to eat kosher. By the way, just FYI, that was free, totally free. So that happens at Bethel, but then he runs back into his brother again. He knows that his brother's coming, and this time his brother's got some his own army of 300 coming at him, and it's not going to be good, right? Because Jacob is still the soft little tent-dwelling dude that he was when he left home, and Esau is still big red, and it wouldn't have worked out well. And so he meets up with him, and yet again he lives into his namesake another time, and he lies straight to Esau's face, and he goes on and he deceives him again. All right, so that's pretty much. I forgot one more thing. His kids while out for a while. That's the next event in his story. And when I say while out, they killed an entire village, right? Parenting problems? No. They had. Can you imagine dealing through that? These guys went and slaughtered an entire village and come home, and they told Dad about it, and you can imagine how well that went over, right? So anyways, that was Jacob's life from Bethel to Bethel experience. Because then God calls him back to another Bethel experience. And I want to pick up, and it's really as we see these two stories. Everybody good with Jacob's story? Everybody good on that? Any questions? Probably I'd answer a question if you had one. Okay, here we go. Here it is. Genesis 35, 1 through 7. So a few chapters later, we see God catch back up with Jacob, and he calls him back to Bethel. Here's what he says. Arise, go up to Bethel and live there, and make an altar there to God who appeared to you when you fled from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments. Remember I told you that the way he left his father-in-law's house could have gotten him killed? Well, it was because his favorite bride, his favorite wife, the pretty one, had taken the idols of the family. And Jacob just sort of spouts off the mouth and is like, if you find this amongst anybody in our crew, I'll kill him, right? And he doesn't know, meanwhile, that it's his wife that has the idols. And so it was almost this really dramatic thing. So from the very beginning, there's been this sort of idolatrous pull towards Jacob, right? That he's never really given his allegiance fully to the one God of Israel, the God of his fathers, but there's always been this sort of low-level idolatry that has existed in his house. And here's what he says, right? Put that stuff away. We're not doing that anymore, right? There's one God, and we're going to follow after him. So they gave to Jacob all the foreign gods which they had, and the rings which were in their ears, and Jacob hid them under the oak which is near Shechem. As they journeyed, there was a great terror upon the cities which were around them, and they did not pursue the sons of Jacob, right? Because the sons of Jacob had just slaughtered an entire village. They didn't want none of that fire, and so they left them alone. So Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. He built an altar there, and check this out. He built an altar there and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. Right? Does Jacob have faith in a relationship with God at this point in the story? And I would say yes. Based off of this, right? Did you notice 35 verse 2? Let's go back to that. So Jacob said to his household and to all who were with him, put away the foreign gods which are among you and purify yourselves and change your garments, right? That's the idolatry. They're putting this away, that there was one God and he was worthy of their worship. But did you also notice that why Jacob had turned back to God? And this is in verse 3. He says, and let us arise and go up to Bethel, and I will make an altar there to God who answered me in the day of my distress. And check this out. Underline this in your Bible if you got it. And has been with me wherever I have gone. what did God promise Jacob at the beginning of his journey, at his first Bethel experience? Did he promise him food and garments and return safely back to his father's house? Did God promise him any of those things? And yet those are the things that Jacob was looking for from God. He says, that if-then paradigm, that if you give me these things and if you allow me to return to my father's house, then I will follow you. And God just says, man, I'm just going to be with you. And Jacob's like, no, I don't know about that. We'll see how it works out, And yet, what has happened over the course of this in what is definitely some valley territory for Jacob? 14 years working hard, strenuous labor. Being sabotaged at every turn. Heartbreak. Family drama, right? Kids that are wilding out in ways that you couldn't even imagine, right? Like doing stuff like who in the world could deal with that sort of a thing? And yet, what does Jacob value at the end of his story as he comes back to Bethel and he meets with God in this mountaintop experience? He values the fact that God did what he said he was going to do, in that God was just with him. Yeah, man, there was food and there was clothing. There was never a moment in which Jacob wasn't taken care of, but that isn't what he values. Well, because you did all these things, because you gave me food and because you gave me garments and because you let me return to my father's land, he doesn't say any of those things. No, it's because you were with me. It's because you were with me when I was toiling away for 14 years in obscurity. You were with me. Because you were with me when everyone was against me. You were with me. And maybe you were quiet. Maybe I didn't see your hand, right? Like immediately, but you were with me nonetheless. You were with me when I was dealing with the family drama and the kids that were going crazy. You were with me in the middle of all of these things. And from the mountaintop, with a new and renewed perspective, he comes to appreciate, I think he appreciated the valley in the fact that God was just with him. So here's the deal, man. Let me do this one more time. I'm going to do this with another character because I could have done this really with any character in the Bible. But I chose Jacob because you get to see a lot of the valleys, right? You get to see his journey of faith. But there was this moment, and here's the deal. We don't know when Jacob come to really realize this. We don't get that moment. I mean, we see the moment that he has his family put away, like the family idols and stuff, but we don't really see the moment that Jacob actually turns and puts his faith in God. Just by the end of his story, we know that he has, right? But what about Moses? You guys, Moses. 10 Commandments, Moses, right? Through the wilderness, parting the Red Seas, Moses, that guy, right? His story doesn't happen in terms of Bethel encounters. His story happens in increments of 40. Let me show you what I mean. Moses is born, and we know this story. This is Moses in the Nile River, right? Pharaoh is killing all the baby boys, and so mom takes she takes Moses and puts him in a basket in the river. He's found by the Pharaoh's daughter, and from there we don't really know what happens to him, right? So we get about 2 days of content at this part of Moses' story. 2 days. Takes up a couple chapters. We get about 2 days of content in this part of Moses' story. And then for the rest of this season right here, we just kind of guess that he grew up in the palace there in Egypt. Probably ostracized because he was a Hebrew and they were fairly hated amongst the Egyptians, right? But we know that he received an education that allowed him to write one of the most beautiful pieces of literary work in the entire world, the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That without the sort of education that he had gotten in that, man, probably wouldn't look the way that it does now. And yet God was shaping and molding Moses' story while he spent 40 years in obscurity there in the palaces of Egypt. And then the next part of Moses' story, you may know that. It's he goes out and he finds an Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew slave, and what does he do to him? You may know. Kills him. Yeah, kills the guy. And then he comes out the very next day, and like a good serial killer, and he's looking for the body, and because he hid it. And what happens? There's some Hebrews that were like, yeah, you come to kill us too, man? We saw what you did. And news gets out, and Moses has to go on the road. So again, we get about another solid 2 days worth of content. And then what happens? Moses leaves, and he leaves into the wilderness of Mount Sinai, and for 40 years he tends sheep on the backside of a mountain in obscurity, and we know nothing of this part of his story. So far, if you're tracking, we got 4 days of content in his life out of 80 years. And then at 80 years old, Moses goes and he sees a bush burning in the wilderness, and he goes and he approaches it. It's God. He sends him to Egypt. It's the whole 10 plagues thing. It's the parting of the Red Sea. He goes up on Mount Sinai. He gets the 10 commandments. He establishes the law. They build a temple. And then they come to the edge of the wilderness there at Canaan, the promised land, right, as he's led the Israelites out. And all of this is less than 2 years' worth of content, I believe. So different people put it at different rates, but 2 years or less, right? About 2 years of content, and that's a lot. That covers like 4 entire books of the Old Testament, right? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, or three books. And then what happens is the spies come back out of the land. Moses sends some spies in the land, and they give a bad report, right? They know the story. They give a bad report, and God says, cool, you guys are going to wander for 40 years. And so that's how Moses spends his last 40 years is in the wilderness. Moses comes out of that 40 years, and he isn't even allowed to go into the promised land. And so he gets to sit on a mountaintop. He delivers what is our book of Deuteronomy. So he goes back out. I don't know if you knew that or not, but Deuteronomy is a sermon. And it is the sermon that Moses preached to the people before they went into the land. So he delivers this sermon. That maybe took a few hours. And then he goes up on a mountain, and he watches them cross over into the land. And Moses is no more. So again, we get another 2 days worth of content. And yet, man, he is this like monolith of the faith, man. He is like this powerhouse patriarch that we look to, man. And yet most of his life remains a mystery to us. We get these little glimpses, these little like mountaintop moments, but here's the question is what God was doing in these moments right here, were they any less important than those mountaintop moments? No, man. In fact, God was using the mundane. He was using those obscure things like homework in the middle of the week, right? Those things that we just do, and it's monotonous, and it's just like it's our duty, and we just do these things, right? And it's not the big mountaintop experience, and yet those are the things that God was using to shape Jacob and Moses, and those are the things that God is using to shape me and you along this journey of faith, right? We could draw another one. What about the apostles? At what point did the doubting Thomas come to actually put his faith in Jesus? Can you pinpoint that in the story? Can you pinpoint, look, what about Peter? Can we pinpoint the point in the story where Peter actually puts his faith in Jesus? Can we pinpoint that? Or is it just sort of like somewhere along this journey of faith, he comes to this realization and begins to follow after Jesus in a way that like transforms everything? Even the night that Jesus dies, he denies him 3 times. And so where was he at along that spectrum, right? So here's the deal. I want to introduce you guys to a tool, something that I think is incredibly helpful and has revolutionized the way that I have thought about the mission of Jesus. And I'm actually going to move this so you guys can kind of see that. Everybody see that? Okay. This is called Ingalls Scale of Evangelism. And it is a visible representation of this idea that faith is a journey, right? And so here's kind of how this works. -10, we would call that someone that is incredibly antagonistic against even the idea of God. So think militant atheist, like not only is God not real, but the fact that you think that God is real, like, offends me, right? So let's like, in the spectrum, obviously goes further on both ends than just this, but that's where sort of -10 is just for reference. And +10 is someone who is following after Jesus, and dude, they've been following after Jesus for years, and they are like disciple makers. They are not just showing people how to follow after Jesus. They're teaching people how to teach other people to the 3rd and 4th generation how to follow after Jesus, man. Right? Like just an incredible life of impact. We'll put them at positive 10. Everybody tracking so far, right? English scale of evangelism. And obviously there's like, 1, 2, 3. I'm not going to keep going because I don't have 10 marks there, and it really bugs my ADHD. So, and then at the 0 mark is that point at which somebody... We'll let him go. Yeah. Is the point at which somebody decides to place their faith in Jesus, right? Like, okay, yeah, man, God is real. Like my sin, my brokenness, that's a real thing that actually affects me greatly. And like, man, Jesus is the answer to this. And there's that moment that somebody steps from death into life, right? And so what happens in like, I don't know, well-meaning evangelistic sermons is all of these steps just sort of melt away, and then we get these 2 categories. Tell me if you've heard of them before. Have you heard that? Lost and saved. There's lost people. There's lost people. People that just don't know Jesus, people that are lost. And then there's people that do know Jesus, and they're saved. Saved from hell, saved from whatever. And that's sort of how the conversation gets. Anybody pretty familiar, right? Like I'm sure if you grew up in a fairly traditional church, that's kind of how that gets voiced. But is it quite that simple? In one sense, yes. In one sense, there is space to the left of this 0, right? In one sense, there is people who don't know Jesus, and that greatly affects every aspect of our life. And there are people on the other side of this, people who have placed their faith in Jesus. And so, in some degree, yes, that is true, but it's not that simple, is it? And there are people along this, like, because we charted where Jacob was in his story, where he first ran into God. He said, yeah, man, maybe negative 2 on the scale is where Jacob was when he came to know God. It was, yeah, maybe God is real. Maybe God is real, but maybe he isn't involved in our story or how that works, or does prayer even work, or like, does he actually have any power to do this, right? So maybe if I just sort of, God, you prove yourself, and if you can prove yourself, God, get me out of this situation, right? In any one of 1,000 different ways. God, rescue me from this, release me from this, right? And if you can do this, man, God, I will believe you have power. And here's the good news, man, is that God, like, he oftentimes rises to the challenge in those situations, right? God doesn't rebuke Jacob. He doesn't say, no, you can't talk to me like that. God doesn't do that. God just says, okay. Jesus shapes the conversation this way in the book of Luke. He says, come, taste, and see that I am good. Dude, experience me. Like, just trust me and see if I don't come through for you in this moment. And you know what? Is God is faithful. And what Jacob realizes over the course of his story as he takes these steps, and maybe these happen rather quickly. Maybe that next step came 8 years into his 14-year servitude to his father-in-law, Maybe it came when God rescued his family from being destroyed as they ran away from his father-in-law. Maybe that's when Jacob took that next step. Maybe it was when Jacob wrestled with God there at Bethel that he took that next step of faith and actually began to trust God in that. That God wasn't there to destroy him, God was there to get his attention, right? Maybe it was when God renamed him Israel and changed his name forever, right? Maybe that's when he took his next step of faith. And here's the deal. If you've been following Jesus for any amount of time, dude, you know that a straight line is not the best way to represent this, right? That it's filled. Mountains and valleys the whole way through, right? That it isn't as simple as just my next step of faith is blank, right? To take this step. Dude, it's on top of a mountain, or we're in the middle of this valley, and yet God is still using every single space along this spectrum to shape and to grow and to move you, right? So where does that leave us? I think a couple of things as we get ready to close out. If we romanticize the mountaintops, because man, like who doesn't want to do all that work to climb K2 and then get there and not actually get to climb to the top of K2, right? You spend $150,000. Bro, we're getting to the top of that mountain. Which is why I can't go climb K2, because I'll end up dead, right? I'll do something stupid. I'll make some decision that's like, no, man, you're not thinking straight. All you have is this mountaintop experience in your mind, and it's going to get you killed. right? Do you know how many people I have watched, like washed up or like a dried husk in the wilderness of their faith because all they can think about is chasing the mountaintop? Let me give you an example. Anybody ever worked with teens before? Okay, a few people, yeah. Take kids to camp before, take kids to church camp. What happens Thursday night? Thursday night's like the night, right? That's like the big, so what typically happens, they take kids to church camp, and they've brought in some like big name evangelist or something, and then like the worship team, they play these like extra emotional songs, and it's like this really big cry fest and like big emotional thing, and like people are like ready to win the world for Jesus after that, right? And then what happens 2 weeks after you get home? It's like, dude, they were ready to go home and like turn their neighborhood upside down for Jesus. And 2 weeks later, you couldn't find them with the FBI, man. Like, they are gone. And like they show up like the next year for youth group, and it's like they sort of restart the cycle again, right? And it's about that like mountaintop. It's like this emotional experience. And it's like, dude, it's not that relating to God isn't partly emotional, because absolutely, sure, it is, but it isn't just emotional, right? And if we just chase the mountaintop of emotions, then where does that leave us in the valleys when it's not emotional, right? And if it's only like the mountaintops of blessing or seeing God's hand working visibly in our life to bring about good things, like what happens when it's not so evident and not so clear? Where does that leave us in our faith in that moment? And yet, it is a forward trajectory. Is that even in those moments, God is still moving and growing and shaping you into a maturity that, man, He can use. It brings about purpose and blessing and a fullness of the human experience that you can't get anywhere else. And that's the claim of Jesus. It's worship, right? It's the emotional experience during worship. And so it's not real worship, right? If we don't have really good music and there isn't a big emotional response. And so what do? We chase the best worship that has the best emotional response. Because without that thing, it wasn't really worship in the first place. And where does that leave us? Dude, it has led to and driven a consumeristic culture around our churches that is eating us alive like a cancer in the churches. All right. So let me deal with this part of it, and then we'll finish out with something else, right? Instead, we have to realize that it's more like this mountain, right? Ups and downs. And so here's the question that I want to leave you with today: is can you still believe that God is with you and working in your story, even in the valleys? Right? Now that's like super philosophical and theological, and what does that even look like in the practical, right? So let me formulate it in a way. Let me form that into a question that I think is a lot more usable. Here's what I want to ask: is what is the next step of faithfulness that you need to take, and are you willing to take it along that journey? What is that next step? That next step, right? We literally have our next steps class today after church, and we're going to be talking about that with a group of people who went through our first steps class. But every week, I try to package whatever we're talking about here into some very practical, very applicable next step. But the question today isn't like, are you going to take X, Y, Z next step? It's just, are you faithful to take a next step along this journey? And maybe that's along a journey, and you're in a valley right now, and it just proves that you trust that God is actually good and with you in this if you continue to take the journey, knowing that He is with you. Now, but we're in this series called For the One, which we're talking about how do we pursue people in our community to love them, to serve them, to bless them well, so that we can share the good news and the hope that we have in Jesus, right? So how does this relate to actually where we're at in this series right now? Well, I think one is we have to realize that every person you meet is somewhere on this spectrum. I had a friend, his pastor, his name's Ed Newton. And Ed was an evangelist. He was the guy they brought in on Thursday nights at camps and stuff, right? Like he had a way of preaching and sharing his faith that was just, people listen to Ed. And so the story goes, he walks into a Burger King one day, and there's this girl crying in the corner. And Ed's like, well, I'm a pastor. I guess I need to, whatever, And so he goes and he sits down. He's like, hey, ma'am, can I, sit down? Can I eat lunch with you, Sure. She sits down. She just begins to spill out. And this is what's going on in my life. And she was She's contemplating suicide. She was not in a good place. It was bad life circumstances. It was all kinds of stuff. It was just culminated in this perfect storm in her life. And over the course of their Whopper meal, Ed shares a faith with her that she comes to accept. And she walks out of there like knowing Jesus in a way that she hadn't before, right? So here's the deal. What if I tell you that that's what evangelism needs to look like for us here at the Outpost? How are we doing in that? Anybody else been to Burger King lately and done something like that? Yep, not me. All right, in fact, I'm a pastor, and the thought of that freaks me out. Just to be completely honest with you. Could I do it, and could I believe that God would be with me and lead me? Yeah, absolutely, man, right? But the thought of if that's what evangelism, if that's what being for the one in our community has to look like, who's in with me on that, right? Yeah, the sign-up list shrinks considerably. But here's the deal. Here's what Ed would tell us, is in the follow-up with her, that actually don't paint him as big of a hero as maybe what you think. In reality, she started her journey down here at the -10 mark, but she had friends, she had family members and coworkers, neighbors, people that loved her and served her and shared the faith, shared the good news and were there to serve her tangibly and love her tangibly, that have walked her down this journey, man, for years. Step after step after step. And there she winds up at a -0.5, sitting in this booth because she can't bring herself to take that final step because she knows all those people. She just can't bring herself to take that next step. And so God supplied the perfect guy at the perfect time in the perfect situation to help her take a step that she otherwise may not have ever taken. Now here's the question. Did Ed have any bigger of a role in her story of coming to faith, coming to know Jesus, than all of these people who worked along her spectrum with her? Did Ed have any bigger of a role in that? Absolutely not. Without that friend, man, who was there and loved her in the middle of this, without that family member who was loving her and encouraging her and was there with her and was serving her, right, in some incredibly big ways along her journey of faith, living out the tangible expression of the kingdom of God for her to see in person, right? Without those things happening, she never would have been at that moment come to follow after Jesus. In that booth with Ed. And that's the reality for every single person that you meet. So we're all somewhere along the spectrum. Here's the deal. If you would say that you're following Jesus, taking the steps after that 0 mark are no less important than they were when you were on the other side of that 0 mark on that spectrum. To continue to follow after Jesus actually means you have to follow Jesus along the journey, right? And yet every person we meet, man, that would say that if you're here this morning maybe and you say that I'm not a follower of Jesus, dude, here's the news that I want to send you out of here with. Is that, dude, we want to recognize your journey. We're not here to shove it down your throat or beat you over the head with our Bibles, because we recognize that it is a journey. We want that to happen in your timing as God leads and moves you. But here's the deal. If you're here and you're in that space and you haven't decided to follow Jesus, let me just say that you're probably a lot closer to this, just being in the sound of my voice here, that you've chosen to be here. You're probably a lot closer to this than maybe you would even think. And for you, I would say, man, we're just here for you. We want to walk with you. We want to journey with you. We're not going to push you. We don't want to force you, because that's not how this journey works. But we do want to love and serve and be with you along the journey. And that's why we exist. And that's where we're headed this summer. As a church, as individuals, as groups and families, we're going outside of these 4 walls. We're going on a journey. We're finding other people who are also on a journey, and we're going to journey alongside them. And you say, well, how do we do that, right? How do we help people take those steps? I'm so glad you asked, because I love to answer questions that you ask. But to know the answer to that, you got to come back next week, because I'm 5 minutes over time this morning, right? Because that's where we're headed next week. Because the reality is that there are barriers between every single one of these. And man, there are barriers here, too, for us that we have to go across. But because we're going through this series entitled For the One, we're going to focus primarily on those barriers that people who haven't yet decided to follow Jesus face. They're natural, they're normal, they're barriers that any critically thinking, rationalizing human being is going to come up against. And man, we need to have the answers. We need to be there to love people and walk through faithfully with people as they have those questions and as they encounter those barriers. Not to try to shove them over the barriers, but to try to be the hand up, to try to be the answer, to be the love and to be the service that displays the kingdom of God well. So that's where we're headed next week. Faith is a journey. We're all on it together, man. We're here for you. We want to journey with you. You guys good? I know it was a lot, dude. I talked like 100 miles an hour today. I want to thank you guys so very much for being here, paying attention this morning. Thank you guys for everything that you do. A couple of last things, and I'm going to close out. Could you guys help us move all of these chairs back against that back wall as you leave out? So these two like sort of sections right here, leave these. But we're going to have our next steps class.